Welcome to Le Rendezvous. My name is Garance Doré and I'm a writer with so many stories to tell and ideas to share that I created this special moment to talk about all the things that are going on in our lives. So come, let's spend a moment together. Le Rendezvous is brought to you by Doré, the skincare line I co-created, wanting to bring more simplicity and efficacy to our lives. Check out the end of the episode for a special code just for you, the Rendezvous listeners. I remember one day being in a very fancy restaurant with a group of friends. And I was there with my ex-boyfriend, and he couldn't stop talking to the waiter and telling him that he knew exactly what his work was like because he had done that work before. And telling him that they were coming from the same world, that he could feel relaxed around him, and that basically everybody else in the restaurant couldn't really understand them because all these rich people around were a little bit ridiculous with all their manners and their idiosyncrasies. And I remember the waiter looking so embarrassed. And I remember thinking, well, maybe the waiter comes from that world. Maybe he comes from one of these families. Maybe he's familiar with these type of restaurants. And maybe this is just a temporary job that he's doing. Maybe he's on his way to becoming the owner of a big hotel. Maybe he doesn't want that level of familiarity with my boyfriend. Maybe he doesn't identify at all with what he's saying. And I remember kind of kicking my boyfriend under the table and being like, what are you doing? Can't you just enjoy sitting on this side of the table and appreciate it and be in the moment and be okay with where you are? Just be there, enjoy the luxury and have your meal with your friends. And that's when he told me, I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of where I come from. And I don't want to pretend that I'm anything else than what I am. And I thought that was a fascinating subject. Today I want to talk to you about social fluidity. Because the truth is, my boyfriend was more middle class than I had ever been. I am a second-generation immigrant. My parents started with nothing. When my grandmother arrived in France, she didn't even speak French. She actually never really spoke French. She didn't know how to write or read. And it was a little bit the same on my father's side. So really, coming from nothing, but funny enough, and I don't know why it's that, but I never really identified with where I come from, my condition, and my socioeconomic level or class. I think I'm very much like my mother, and she's never been encumbered by these type of things. She was always very ambitious, she wanted to grow, and she didn't see why she shouldn't. She didn't have this glass ceiling until much later in her life. She hit it at some point, which is so fascinating. But she never felt like she really belonged anywhere. She just was very curious about people and about the world. And she never really had a judgment about somebody's class or where they came from. There was always a lot of mix in my family. When I was young, we had a restaurant. When my parents were still together, they were working together. And so it's very interesting because these kind of places are social theaters sometimes. My family and I were on the service side. My dad was in the kitchen, he was the chef. My mom was front of the house and I was a waiter when I was starting, I think, when I was 14. But the funny thing is that my mom was always fabulous and unapologetic and interested. And through the restaurant, where we had a very elegant clientele of people coming on their boats from everywhere, from Italy, from the south of France. So we had a lot of doctors and celebrities, and we had princes and princesses and models. There were also more regular people, but I remember my mother making friends with some of her clients and never seeing really a problem with that. Whereas my father, who was in the kitchen, would never understand why she had that curiosity. He would always say things like, we're not these people, we're the little people. I don't know where he gets that from. I think it's a French expression, les petites gens, the small people, the people who, work in factories that have less ambitious lifestyle. So there was this interesting background. And then there was the city where I was living. Small town, everybody knew where I came from, what my parents were doing. And I had no idea because I think because of my mother, I was never raised with a sense of belonging to any class in particular or any socioeconomical background. We were becoming, we were going somewhere. But I remember one day I was at school, I must have been 10 or 11. And this girl came to me and she was like, I know who you are. You can't hide it. You're just like me. You're an immigrant. You're an Arab. You're poor. You're like me. And it was very funny because I've never tried to hide that. It's okay for me. But she was so aggressive because I think maybe because I was never really carrying that identity around with me. And maybe she could feel it. Or maybe I was projecting something that was making her feel inferior and she felt like she had this big secret about me. And I never felt like it was a secret. My friends knew I had this very Moroccan grandma. And I was never really ashamed of her. There were moments where I was made to feel weird. But overall, very early, I was able to appreciate all the cultures that I came from. So all these things never really bothered me. My background and my culture, and also the level of our finances, were constantly moving, constantly changing. Just to tell you a little more about how my mother was engaging in all of that. So my grandmother, who was this very Moroccan woman of the old generation, wearing a scarf on her head, long skirts, barely speaking French, she was a cleaning lady at the house of the most prominent family in the city that I was growing up in. So they had the most beautiful house, they were landowners all over Corsica, and they were the most respected family in town. Often my grandmother would take care of me. I would go spend the day with her as she was cleaning the house. And they had a daughter that was my mom's age. And my mother became friends with her, and they're still friends to this day. And it's so interesting because to me, this shows that the barriers that we create are more in our head than they actually are tangible. So that was a little bit of my background. I could tell you so much more about the chasm in thinking about their condition and where they came from between my mother and my father. But what I can tell you is that my mother grew socially and financially much, much more than my father. And I think that's one of the things that caused their divorce. They just had this very different vision of themselves. And I think they were banging against walls and kept fighting because in my father's head, with his thinking, there were the things that were allowed to him and the things that weren't. And in a way, he was very comfortable in that box. And he still is. And he's actually a very happy man that's never really outgrown his condition. And I completely respect that. And on the other hand, my mother completely broke all the barriers and evolved and changed and became an intellectual, something that you would never have thought from where she was coming from, something no one could have predicted for her. Coming from that background and learning mostly from my mother because she was the one I was spending the most time with, and she was definitely my biggest influence in life, for better or worse sometimes. I went about life the same way. I was never bothered with where I was coming from. I met people from different backgrounds, and instead of feeling like I didn't belong, I felt, oh, I need to learn that. This is interesting. And that curiosity would be the same whether it was going to have dinner at an ambassador's house or whether it was meeting people that one could have said were below me in terms of their social conditions, social belonging. I never, ever saw that as an issue. I always was a social chameleon, and that really helped me when I started in this world of fashion. I think that's one of the things that defined my growth, is that not only did I not see a problem with the idea of growing and evolving and meeting people from different places and different worlds and different social background, but there was a lot of curiosity for me. It was all about that. And maybe that's what makes me a photographer, a writer. It's because I have this endless curiosity and I don't have a lot of judgment around what people own and where they come from and how much money they have. I don't care. I think it's all interesting and it's all fascinating and it's all rich in terms of culture. I had this curiosity and I have this empathy and I also have a lot of respect. I think that there are things to be learned at every level, and it's not so interesting to just think about going up, up, up. The idea for me was always to communicate, to share, to understand, to discover, to listen to other people's stories, their worlds, where they came from. That's really all that mattered to me. Of course, I was growing also in my career, and therefore, through the world of fashion, it is a place where you will find a lot of people that belong to higher spheres of society. Whether it's all the socialites, people that belong to royalty, people with immense wealth, there are always moments if you have a little bit of power, if you have a name, if you have something interesting to these people, there's always a moment when you're going to brush with them and meet them. And the funny thing is that, again, I went at it with my curiosity and my complete lack of understanding of who I was, where I came from, why it could be a problem, and why, for some people, it might be very easy to classify me. Of course, as I was just explaining, I'm very good at learning other people's traditions. It's a form of respect for me. And I remember when I was very young finding this book on manners. And obviously, when you come from a little village in Morocco, you don't have the same sense of manners than if you live in the beautiful neighborhoods of Paris. And I remember finding this book about manners when I was maybe 15, something like that. And I was fascinated and I learned everything because I was like, how come I don't know all these things? I love these rules. I think they're beautiful. I think they're interesting. And I also feel that it should be part of everyone's vocabulary. So I was quite versatile. You could basically put me anywhere and I would look like I belonged. And if I didn't know something, I was very good at asking discreetly and making it a joke because the idea was never to hide where I was coming from. The idea was always to be respectful of the manners of the people that were inviting me or in whose presence I was. So I would learn very quick by mimicking, by asking, by learning, by Googling. I remember in my book, Love, Style, Life, writing about etiquette and how in moving up in the society of New York, I had to learn everything about etiquette. There were so many things that I didn't know. But instead of feeling like I was betraying my people or my social status or wherever I came from, I just felt like I was expanding my horizons. And I've always felt like that. And I think it's one of the things that stays a secret that people always talk about how to become successful, how to raise your profile, but they never talk about these subtle things that help you move easily through all the layers of society, up and down. I think it's one of the biggest skills that no one is talking about. That's why I'm talking about it today. There is one time in my life, though, where I finally hit a glass ceiling, one that I think I'll never really be able to get over, and mainly because I don't really care to. I remember talking with one of my friends from fashion. She was immensely rich, part of an aristocratic family. And I remember feeling that there was something between us that could never really match. But I also loved how natural she was about all these, how matter of fact, and how much she understood all the inner workings of society and how she completely understood where I came from, where she came from, what we could bring to one another. And I remember telling her about two of my fashion friends that I loved, that I thought were amazing, great friends, people that I can count on, and telling her, it's interesting because with these two girls, we're great friends, but I could never feel like we were best friends. There is something, there is kind of a veil between us, something that's always there and that's keeping us a little bit apart. And she told me something that I'll never forget. She said, "But you don't understand, Garance. You're just not part of this world. You will never be part of this world." And she started explaining to me the society from which they came from and how she had grown up in it and she could see so many things that I couldn't see, and that it was okay. And I loved having this conversation because they are so rare. Somebody who says, look, this is our world. You can't understand it exactly because we grew up in that. Since we were kids, we were told that we needed to marry that way and behave that way and be friends with people who come from here. And there are a lot of rules that you don't have in your world and that I can explain to you if you want. But that is what you're feeling, is that veil between you. And it's very interesting because right now I'm reading a book from one of the members of my community. I have this newsletter and I have a community and we're a group of women and so many of them are fascinating. And anyway, last time I met one of them who's an author and who I loved right away. And I started reading her book. And she told me, "Are you sure you want to read my books? It's very Jackie Collins, I don't know if you're going to love it." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? Jackie Collins is like one of my favorites. I love this type of books." And the name of my new friend is Tasmina Perry. And I'm reading right now a book of hers that's called Gold Diggers, which, just the title of it, I'm like, yes, sign me right away. And she's so incredibly good at explaining how these societies work. Her book is settled in England, which is a whole other story when it comes to class, because obviously here you have an aristocracy. And so this should be a whole subject for another episode. I'm fascinated, but I literally do not understand anything about what's going on here. For example, here in the UK, your accent says a lot about you. And I don't really think we have that in France as much. In Paris, everybody pretty much has the same accent. But in the UK, your accent kind of classifies you. People know if you've been to private school, to public school, where you come from. And I know that some people even change their accents, for example. It's a very interesting subject. So anyway, I'm reading Gold Diggers, and it's so interesting because it explains a lot of behind the scenes of how this world works. In that case, it's more about women trying to go after billionaires, but it shows a lot of things that I completely was blind to. Because in my world, you just marry for love. A marriage is not an investment. It's not a way to access a certain society. But I thought it was a fascinating read. And yes, very Jackie Collins, but in the best of ways. To go back to my story with my boyfriend, he reminded me so much of my father. Adorable, hardworking, humble, and very, very much stuck in this box. And I reminded me so much of my mother. Ambitious, curious, and with no boundaries to where she thought she could go. And to me, it's not just that it's more comfortable, it's that it makes my life so much more interesting and rich and different. This ability and this freedom. And even if I can feel that sometimes I am determined by where I come from, I know that I have the freedom to choose wherever I want to go. And one thing that was very interesting, because I've experienced it when I was in fashion, is that in any society, there will always be people to remind you where you came from. So you remember the story of me at school and that girl telling me that I was trying to hide where I came from. I remember one day talking with one of my fashion friends about one of these socialites who had really made it. You probably know her, I won't say her name, but she married an extremely wealthy man and she now belongs to some sort of royalty somewhere. And she's one of the fixtures of New York social life, and she's at every Met Gala, and she's living that dream. It's not my dream, but it's the dream that made so many books and so many movies and all that. And I was talking with my fashion friend, and when I say fashion friend, means people you see at the show, people you sit next to at a dinner, at Fashion Week, and not somebody necessarily that you see outside of that. I was talking with her about that woman, and the first thing she did was call her with her maiden's name. And I said, "Who are you talking about?" She said, "That woman, that's her maiden's name. She doesn't come from that world, you know. She married up." And she started explaining to me that she was just a normal girl coming from the middle of America, and she had done very well for herself. And I remember thinking, wow, she made it, but there will always be people to remind her or to talk behind her back of where she came from. And I hope that she doesn't give a shit about that. And it's funny because in Tasmina's books, it's exactly the same thing that happens. You see all these women striving to go up in society for whatever reasons that I'm definitely not judging. And at some point, there's always someone to remind them where they came from. And I thought, can't you just leave her alone, living her dream, whether she plotted to go there or maybe she's just living a wonderful love story and she's enjoying her life. See, I've never judged rich people just because they're rich. I've never judged aristocrats just because they were aristocrats. And I've also never judged poor people, people that my father likes to call the little people. My father has this type of lifestyle now. He lives with very little, and in a way, that's what he always wanted. And my mom was making him unhappy with her huge ambitions. He's incredibly happy now. He's actually a great example of what true success is. It's not about having more, it's about finding your own definition of peace and happiness. And that's what I always try to explain that ex-boyfriend of mine. And that is that if you're judging the value of people on where they come from and what they have, you're obliterating their personality and who they are. And that thinking that you know where they came from because of something like their job is just another mistake. And it's rather patronizing, actually. They might be kind, they might be interesting, they might be cultivated wherever they come from. And he would hear me, but something in him was locked. And I understood one day that he would never come out of this box. And I respected him, but it was an irreconcilable difference between us, and something that I think would have driven me mad and would have driven him crazy, just like my mother and father in their time. And this sense of curiosity and this sense that the world is big and open and that you can go wherever you want if you arrive with a spirit of openness, of curiosity, of not labeling people, of just opening your heart. This, I think, comes from my most inherent value, the thing that I carry so close to my soul. And it's the idea of freedom. I want to feel free in this world. I want to know where I come from, but I don't want to feel stifled by it. And to me, that's what social fluidity is about. It's not about money. It's not about hiding who you are. It's not about betraying your people. It's just about showing curiosity and showing openness and giving people the benefit of the doubt that anywhere they come from the highest spheres of society to the most modest one, they might be fascinating, interesting, enriching to you, and you might be the same way for them. And when you think like that, the world is your oyster, and it's beautiful, and it's big, and it's full of wonderful people and possibilities. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'm sending you love. Le Rendezvous is brought to you by Doré. Doré's latest launch, La Micellaire, is a botanical micellar cleansing water that doesn't require rinsing. Minimize bathroom time and maximize outdoor time with our super simple routine. Use code podcast10 for 10% off your first order. Thank you for listening to Le Rendezvous. If you want to know more about me, find out about my newsletter and my community, find me on Instagram at Garance Doré or at my website at garance.world. And well, if you'd like to find out how to spell that crazy name, just check out the show notes. Until next time, sending you love.